Hello, BookTube. Jordan Parsons and I are doing a read-along of Never Call Retreat, Volume 3 in Bruce Catton's Centennial History of the American Civil War. And we're finishing up today. It was a lot of fun. I'm going to email him and hope that he wants to do another read-along. That would be a lot of fun. And as long as I'm pampered along the way, as a major sexy influencer should be, I don't see any reason why we couldn't. But this is the final volume in the series, in the trilogy, and as such, you know what's coming, right? Any reader of this will know what's coming. The South has long since lost the material ability to pursue the war in any meaningful way. They know they can't win. Their railroads have been cut. Their access to the Mississippi or to the sea has been cut. All possibility of foreign alliances has ended. Their manpower is wilting away on any march of any of the armies that are remaining. There'll be arms just stacked along the way of men that just disappeared. They realize that the end is coming. They don't want to be there when it happens. Robert E. Lee keeps an army in the field, but most of the Confederacy is supine, utterly helpless before the Northern forces. A fact that you see with Sherman's various marches of destruction and degradation. In fact, Catton mentions that and puts it really well. He says the point of all this was that Sherman's campaign could not be tried or even thought of rationally, except against a foe who was in the process of collapse. To abandon communications and march 60,000 men some 300 miles through enemy territory with nothing ahead except the prospect of storming a fortified city to keep the 60,000 from starvation was an idea that was wholly insane from a military standpoint, except that the enemy had become powerless. And that is what remains. What remains is to hunt down those armies, get their surrenders, and force Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, to surrender, to end the war. And Catton raises the possibility here, or a possibility that was raised at the time, of how that could go. If the South decided to bitter end it, if they decided we will take this fight to the hills and hollers, then it might never end. They were warned of that. Catton writes, the unquenchable guerrilla warfare this an officer that brings it up to Lee, had been hinting at was perhaps the one thing that would have ruined America forever. It was precisely what Federal soldiers like Grant and Sherman dreaded most, the long, slow-burning, formless uprising that goes on and on after the field armies have been broken up, with desperate men using violence to provoke more violence, harassing the victor and their own people with a sullen fury no dragoons can quite put down. Catton goes on with a passage that I believe Jordan read to you in his video. I want to read it myself as well. There'll be a bit of reading of Bruce Catton to finish this out. Because he meditates on this. The final chapter here, there's a lot of meditation on the meaning of what he's been narrating all this time. Yet men have to live by their memories, and the memory of death and defeat is bitter enough to keep unforgiving men carrying their rifles across the hills for generations. Lee made it possible for men to turn this memory into a strange source of strength, a tragic and moving remembering that provided a base on which the present could be accepted and the future could be faced. Because of what happened when he and Grant met at last, Lee was, when he left Appomattox, a paroled soldier without an army, rode straight into legend, and he took his people with him. The legend became a saving grace. The cause that had failed became the lost cause, larger than life, taking on color and romance as the years passed, remembered with pride and with heartache, but never again leading to bloodshed. Civil wars have had worse endings than this. When you combine that with the previous quote about how those men up in the hills are a sullen fury no dragoons can quite put down, you have entered the land of fantasy. Civil wars have had worse endings than this, yes, but not by much. It's a terrible ending. First of all, well-trained dragoons are going to quench those men up in the hills with their rifles eventually. It might not happen on a neat, pretty armistice day, but it will happen. And the terms that General Grant gave to General Lee, your men can keep their sidearms. More importantly, they can keep their honor. This was just a friendly disagreement. Civil wars have had worse endings than this. Well, what do we mean by an ending? here? What is Catton thinking of as an ending? Is he thinking about men shooting men, about victors shooting the losers? Because he's sure as hell not thinking about 30 years of Reconstruction. He's sure as hell not thinking about the fact that there was a lost cause has led to more misery by, I would argue, a factor of 100,000 than would have been a more vindictive end to this Civil War. The vindictive end that I think was the only rational thing to do that wasn't done. Abraham Lincoln didn't want it. General Grant didn't want it, so it was never going to happen. And it led to toxic romanticizing. Catton gives a famous quote here. It was also given pride of place at the end of Ken Burns' great documentary of the Civil War, which you should all watch if you haven't seen it. It's not like any documentary. You should all see it if you haven't. But I want to read that quote. It's from, needless to say, a Southern veteran. I want to read the whole thing, your indulgence here. Who knows, but it may be given to us after this life to meet again in the old quarters, to play chess and draughts, to get up soon to answer the morning roll call, to fall in at the tap of the drum for drill and dress parade, and again to hastily don our war gear while the monotonous patter of the long roll summons to battle. Who knows, but again the old flags, ragged and torn, snapping in the wind, may face each other and flutter, pursuing and pursued, while the cries of victory fill a summer day. And after the battle, then the slain and wounded will rise, and all will meet together under the two flags, all sound and well, and there will be talking and laughter and cheers, and all will say, did it not seem real? Was it not as in the old days? And that's an artsy-fartsy rhetorical question, but the answer to it is no. It wasn't like that in the old days, and this veteran certainly knows that. Bright, marching to and fro on a bright summer day. What absolute hoo-ha. What nonsense. What about the screams of the wounded for 2 days while their faces are eaten by hogs? What about any of that? This is just nonsense. And when you introduce the romantic lost cause, the valiant generals, the barefoot soldiers in gray, you open the door to this kind of thing. And I understand where Bruce Catton was coming from here. I understand what was on his mind, I think, when he was writing these passages, and it sure as hell wasn't the American Civil War. It was Vietnam. I understand what he's saying here, that you've got to give men something, a dream that they can hold on to. Well, I do have a dream that they could have held on to. It was the dream called the United States of America, that Boston endured occupation and rude insults and blood in order to build. That was the dream. The United States of America. If these men who took up arms against the United States of America and shot Boston and Iowa boys in the face, if they need a better dream than that, then maybe what they should have had was summary execution. As certain Bostonians advocated at the time, every male Southerner between the ages of 13 and 80 summarily put to death. All the younger children transported north, west, or to the territories, and the ground salted, made unusable for agriculture forever. Kill the male population, salt the earth, and transport everyone else. Let's not call them slaves of war. Let's give them homes and maybe subsidies, but they don't get to live there anymore. They don't get to live in the old home anymore. They don't get to live in their old neighborhood anymore. They must be immigrants living on the suffrage of the people there who are their new hosts. Now, if those terms seem vaguely familiar to you, then maybe you're a student of history. Those have been typically considered liberal terms for a Civil War ending. So Civil Wars have had worse endings than this. Okay, fine. But did the Civil War end? It seems to me that the truth of Catton's claim, Civil Wars have had worse endings than this, is posited on the Civil War having ended. I don't really see that myself. Not a whole lot. And if you don't end it and make sure it's ended, you can guarantee that it will come back. In the armed insurrection to overthrow my government and install Donald Trump as an unelected leader, presumably for the rest of his life, men carrying Confederate battle flags walked through the halls of the Capitol. So did it end? And might it have ended a little bit better if it had ended a little bit more definitively, even if it was cruel? I don't know. Obviously, no one can have answers to those questions. I have been saying for a long, long time that once Grant had Lee's very polite, very gentlemanly signature on articles of capitulation, and Lee was walking down the steps to Traveler to mount his horse and ride off to his men. When he was walking down those steps, Grant should have said to his men, arrest him and hang him right now in front of his men. Strip him and hang him. And don't just strip him of his clothes. I also want you to pull his beard off. Then hang him from the highest branch of the tallest tree in front of his men. And then hang them. And that didn't happen. So am I right, or is Bruce Catton right? I have no idea. Certainly it is a common truism, even today, for people to say it was the finest hour. It was Grant's finest hour not to call for his stereotypical unconditional surrender. Myself, I say it was never more called for than in that moment. No terms. You give us everything. You walk out naked. If I let you live, you walk out naked. You and all your men. No horses, no guns. I don't care about your plowing. I don't care about the folks back home. You rebelled against the country. You drew blood. Marched armies against the country. So you can starve for all I care. I'll let you live, and that's it. But you're going out. You're leaving Appomattox Courthouse in your bare feet. I have said that at least should have been done. I don't think any of the Southern generals should have been allowed to live. Would that have produced a different 2022 than we see today? I have no idea. No idea at all. But Catton meditates on that a bit. And then he moves on to meditating about the end of everything, the end of his account. He barely touches Reconstruction at all. He sort of ends, I think, as far as he's concerned, usually as far as many historians of the war are concerned, especially older, the 20th century historians, the war is over when Lincoln is over, when Lincoln dies. So he gives us a passage that is very good. The final chapter is To the Dark, Indefinite Shore. And it's really good. This is Catton at his best, this paragraph. It began with one act of madness, and it ended with another. John Brown heard history's clock strike in the night and tried to hurry the dawn along with gunfire. Now John Wilkes Booth heard the clock strike, and he tried with gunfire to restore the darkness. Each man stood outside the human community, directed by voices the sane do not hear, and each kept history from going logically. Brown, the Old Testament prophet gone wrong, wrote that the crimes of the guilty land must be washed out with blood, and in bloodshed he evoked the nation to learn. The nation learned that some things cannot be washed out that way. I didn't do that justice. Brown, the Old Testament prophet gone wrong, wrote that the crimes of the guilty land must be washed out with blood, and in bloodshed he evoked the nation learned that some things cannot be washed out that way. Booth, the actor who played for an audience that lived far back in the shadows, wrote that America was forever ordained to be the white man's country, leaving his fellows to reflect that the Negro had also become an American. The line from Harper's Ferry to Ford Theater is a red thread binding the immense disorders of the Civil War into an irrational sort of coherence. Just wonderful. Just wonderful. It reminds me that Carl Sandburg, in his 3-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln, is also at his absolute quotable best at the very end with the assassination of Lincoln. His account of Booth's assassination of Lincoln is amazing for prose. But that brings us to the end. Bruce Catton doesn't go much further than that. He's mainly concerned with telling the story of the war. Once it's over, and once the man who had some fitful glimmer of Reconstruction, a good Reconstruction, in his mind, once that mind is dark, he's not going to carry the story much further than that. So it ends. And that brings us to the end of the centennial history of the American Civil War. I will retire the bookmarks that I have in here. I will retire the mechanical pencil that I was using as a bookmark, and also a Book of the Month Club. Henry Steele Commager wrote the Book of the Month Club report on this book. Once upon a time, those were coveted reading. They make great reading. I wish there were a whole book of them. We'll retire this now, and we'll see if Jordan wants to do another read-along. It's a little bit late to be organizing an August read-along. Maybe he'll do something for September. But it was a lot of fun. Great deal of fun to go through this at length. I wish, with a little more forethought, I would probably have put us through all 3 volumes of this at an equally slow pace, just to enjoy it. But I've now got a very lovingly marked up volume. So those of you who are following along, I hope you were enjoying it. I'd love to hear what you think. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. I'll leave a link to Jordan's video down below, and I will see you soon. Thank you, Bertrand.